Right, hello everybody. Welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James, and just before we start this webinar, I'm going to run you through the technical stuff, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. So it's a bit of a cast of thousands today, and we're going to be running on until 1:30, and this is where everybody is. And I will just give you the timeline, and then I will introduce our chair, who is going to be Eric Brunner. So this is the timeline. The two main presentations are going to be by Richard Wilkinson and Gill Livingston. We're going to have a few words from two of the other contributors, or I think they're actually both editors of the book. And then we should get to the Q&A session at about 1:10. So let me start briefly by introducing Professor Eric Brunner. So he's Professor of Social and Biological Epidemiology at UCL, and he is one of the co-editors of today's book on health in Japan since the Tokyo Olympics in 1964. His research focuses on health inequalities, aging, and public health. He also works at Osaka University as well as UCL, together with two of the co-editors. And of course, being a professor of social and biological epidemiology, he has been in particularly hot demand this year. But he is also one of UCL's most highly cited researchers. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Eric to chair the actual seminar.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation, to Nana, Edmund, and Alice for hosting this meeting. It's a great pleasure to be celebrating the publication of the book with you all today, and thanks especially to everyone in Japan who are joining on a public holiday because it's Labor Day in Japan. It is also a great pleasure to welcome our two distinguished guest speakers, Gill Livingston, leading psychiatrist of old age at University College London, and Richard Wilkinson, social epidemiologist and co-author of several influential books, including The Spirit Level and The Inner Level. Co-editors Hiroyasu Iso and Noriko Cable will talk about our book after our main speakers. And as Jason has said, we will then have discussion time. So we submitted the proposal for this book in April of 2018. It has been an ambitious project involving no less than 32 authors, 30 of whom are Japanese, writing in English. Many of them are in this seminar today, thanks to Zoom. The editors are particularly grateful for the strong support of the publisher. Nicola Wilson, our commissioning editor from Oxford, has kindly agreed to say a few words. Nicola.
Thank you, Eric. As Eric mentioned, I'm the editor-in-chief for UK Medical Books and also the commissioning editor for public health and epidemiology titles at Oxford University Press, where we have a strong history of producing projects that examine the causes of well-being, disease, their trends, and inequalities. I originally spoke to Eric back in March 2018, which feels a long time ago now, but even at the time I felt this was a very timely project, and it appealed to me as a publisher because it highlights a wonderful array of topics. It was unique and intriguing because Japan's population is famous for its longevity and the high level of social cohesion. The peer reviewers that I consulted about the project agreed. They recognised that the book would be an important resource for students, public health professionals, medical doctors, and policymakers. And I'm confident that this book will enable readers to develop an understanding of the socio-economic, cultural, and behavioural determinants of health in Japan. I'm particularly keen that the content of the book helps to inform them about what may be done to close the remaining health gaps in a country that is already remarkably healthy. Eric, thank you very much for approaching Oxford University Press with your idea, and thank you also to your co-editors, Dr. Cable and Professor Iso, for their help and bringing the project to fruition. And also thank you to the contributors, because it's their hard work in producing this excellent book that has paid off.
Thank you, Nicola. Very, very kind words. I'll now introduce the book briefly with a few slides before passing on to Richard Wilkinson. The book has forewords by Senator Kaizo Takemi, who is the WHO Goodwill Ambassador for Universal Healthcare, and Michael Marmot, leading global public health advocate. And you may well not know that his doctoral research was based on heart disease risk in the Japanese community of San Francisco. In July, we added a prologue to the book on Japan's COVID-19 pandemic, and you'll shortly see some key statistics. The book has 20 chapters and 3 sections: health across the life course, chronic disease and risk factor trends, and then a few chapters at the end under the heading of Japan and the planet. Japan, as Nicola said, has long been famous for its life expectancy. Over the past 50 years, life expectancy at birth has risen by more than 2.5 years per decade, and now stands at 87 years in women and 81 in men. The headline statistics of the trend in the death rate show Japan's global lead. 3 points here. 1, the health of the Japanese population continues to improve through the low economic growth period. 2, the improvement continues after the financial crisis in 2008. And 3, the death rate in the USA and the UK, unlike Japan, stagnates during austerity. That's over there on the right-hand side of the graph. In terms of social care, Japan has had a system of long-term care insurance since the year 2000. So that places the United Kingdom now 20 years behind in policy for looking after older people. Japan is well known for social equality. Income inequality measured by the Gini measure, which is in the left-hand column, seems to have grown, but it is still well below that in the US and the UK. The data on COVID-19 deaths is certainly consistent with the idea that social solidarity is strong in Japan. Look at the difference in the cumulative deaths. Last week, Japan, with twice the population of the UK, had recorded 1,900 deaths, compared with 53,000 deaths in the UK. Japan is famous for its healthy diet. Professor Iso's chapter confirms cultural resistance to westernization. The proportion of adult Japanese overweight or obese was recently 29% compared to 65% in the UK, an extraordinary difference. Japan has given us this fascinating natural experiment. The question is, did low economic growth in Japan in the period 92 to 2013 lead to poorer health and greater health inequality? And here we can see that the Nikkei index rose exponentially between 1950 and 1990. The economy then stagnated for 23 years. Ayako Hiyoshi and Kaori Honjo, among the book authors, analyzed the official survey series, the CSLC, with more than 600,000 participants, to show that despite low growth over 2 decades, the income inequality stayed low. And in this period, if you focus on the top right-hand panel, you can see that among working age adults, reporting a general sense of well-being went down slightly after 1992, but the proportion reporting poor health stayed well below 20%. Inequality in well-being, again, working age adults shown on the top right-hand panel, was small in 1992 and was the same at the end of the low growth period. These are remarkable findings which highlight the continuing resilience of Japanese society. The 300+ pages of our book are packed with much information and discussion such as this. Do please consider buying it. A 30% discount code will be emailed to you by Daiwa, so the price will be £28 or $38 US. And so now I hand you over to Richard Wilkinson.
I think what Eric has said shows what an extraordinarily interesting and important book this is, requiring a great deal of rethinking, posing really interesting problems. And I really thank everyone who's been involved in its writing and production. It's really nice also to be included in the launch of it. It's a book that's quickly becoming a close friend of mine, full of carefully considered evidence, presented in a way which means that you can't help but grapple with questions, not only of social determinants of health and health inequalities, but also of what causes what on a much larger socioeconomic canvas. I'll have to keep it on my desk within easy reach, I think. And in important sense, though, it's a book about well-being, seen much more widely than physical health on its own. It's about social cohesion, about loneliness, economic growth, inequality, suicide, employment, the position of women, social change, child well-being, and the problems of an aging population. And because health has powerful psychosocial determinants, it's about the subjective as well as the objective experience of life. There's a growing academic industry of people concerned with the environmental crisis who are trying to develop measures of well-being to replace GDP per capita. But most of that work is based on individual subjective reports of happiness or life satisfaction, vulnerable to all manner of what we might call false consciousness. But population health, both physical and mental, gives us a more powerful angle on these issues. Supplementing individual data, this book makes us think also about the impact of population-wide structural change and the impact it has on objective measures of health through both material and psychosocial pathways. And when we remember that the research has shown the importance of the high quality of social relations to both health and happiness, we see that we're looking at issues very similar to those on which the happiness and life satisfaction researchers focus, but through different and I think better lenses. As many of you know, my work has been focused on the effects of income inequality, but my main interest is in the effect of inequality on the psychosocial environment, on the quality of social relations in society. Income inequality acts as a social stressor. As people have intuited over the centuries, inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. Social epidemiology and our understanding of the social determinants of health have been transformed during my career by the recognition, first, that there are powerful psychosocial influences on health, such as friendship, which we now know work primarily through chronic stress, and then by the recognition that social status was not just a proxy for class differences in exposure to material causes of health and illness, but that social status itself had a powerful direct influence on health. Sociologists have, of course, spent a lot of time arguing about the best way to classify populations into different social classes. But income inequality is primarily about how far apart these classes are, however they're classified. In effect, material inequalities of wealth and income make class and status more powerful, increasing their grip on our lives. This is shown by a wide range of outcomes, including, for instance, the decline in interclass marriages with greater inequality, the decline in social mobility, the increase in status anxiety, the decline in social cohesion. In general, as material inequalities increase, social gradients in a wide range of outcomes, from the educational performance of school children to physical and mental health, become steeper. In an important sense, research such as that presented in this book on health in Japan is moving us towards, I think, a clearer view of what would constitute a good society. Although economists and others have tried to define the determinants of happiness and life satisfaction, their measures of those states have almost always been self-reports, which are obviously slippery customers. That international differences in self-reported health bear precious little relationship to mortality should be a warning to us about comparing subjective measures internationally. But social epidemiologists, in contrast, have the advantage of being able to examine objective measures sensitive to subjective well-being, including not only death rates, but also measures of stress related to hormones. As Michael Marmot once remarked, health is probably a better indicator of happiness than people's answers to survey questions about happiness. And beyond that, causes of death tell us something about the kinds of unhappiness people are experiencing. Most obviously, as in the example of the so-called deaths of despair in the USA, caused particularly by increasing death rates from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. The quality of social relationships and the social environment more widely is crucial to well-being because members of the same species have the potential to be anything from each other's most awful threats and rivals to the best sources of assistance, cooperation, and learning. Inequality affects the extent to which we share or are rivals, whether we have relationships of reciprocity or of mistrust and opposition. The first is marked by friendship, cooperation, and mutuality, and the second by relations of dominance and subordination, mistrust and opposition. But not only are good social relations conducive to well-being and bad social relations to high levels of anxiety, but it seems increasingly likely that our responses to these patterns are built on our evolved psychology. I want now to show you a few slides which serve, I think, as a reminder, first of how far-reaching are the effects of inequality, and then of the likelihood that our responses to it are rooted in our evolved psychology. So I'm now going to share some slides with you. I hope. Am I sharing? Yes. The first thing I think I want to say is it would be wrong to think about inequality as some new determinant of health or any other outcomes. It tells us more about the class gradients, the class differences that we've always known and understood, that health and educational performance of children and endless other things are worse in poorer areas. in a sense, we're dealing with whether our societies have a very steep social pyramid like that, or a much shallower one. And that has multiple effects. And we can see that it makes inequality makes class and status more important, increasing residential segregation, reducing the proportion of interclass marriages, weakening community life, and reducing social mobility, all highly correlated with inequality. Another way of looking at the sense in which inequality makes social status and class more important is this work from Leighton Whelan showing the different levels of status anxiety across the range of incomes, from the poorest tenth to the richest tenth. The top line are the higher levels of status anxiety in more unequal societies. So we're all more worried about how others see and judge us. Status becomes more important. We also know how this, because we're more worried about status, we try and present ourselves in a more positive light to other people. We get, if you like, more narcissistic. And so there's research which shows if you live in more unequal countries or areas, you become more consumerist. Status goods, flashy car, clothes with the right designer labels and so on. All this stuff to do with self-presentation becomes more important. I think I'll skip that one to save time. You also see, this is a very recent paper, an important one, I think, which shows levels of honesty declining in more unequal societies to the right. And so it's one of these experiments in which you see how many apparently lost wallets are returned. And in more equal societies on the left, about 80% perhaps are returned. But on the right, perhaps only 20% of them are returned. So, that is an indication of social cohesion, if you like, whatever you want to call it. Really powerful effects. And interestingly, as we know, social cohesion breaks down, violence increases and so on. You also see with that this, as two American economists have shown, both internationally and amongst the 50 American states, that the proportion of the labor force involved in what they call guard labor, that means security staff, prison officers, police, increases. A higher proportion of the labor force are involved in these occupations to protect ourselves from each other. As reciprocity and cohesion break down in society, mistrust increases and so on. Really, I think, powerfully indicative of the effect of inequality on social relations. And we also know quite a lot about the implications of all this and the increased dominance and subordination, superiority and inferiority on mental health. Perhaps the causal pathway is shown particularly by Sherry Johnson at Berkeley and her colleagues. A recent paper in the British Medical Journal showing the remarkable correlations between different psychological mental health conditions and inequality internationally. That's amongst the 36 OECD countries. And as I said earlier, the decline in intergenerational social mobility with greater inequality. Then a few indications of why I see this in terms of our evolved psychology and sensitivity to social status differences. First, that bullying goes up in more unequal societies. This is bullying amongst school children, huge differences in the rates of bullying. And of course, if you think of monkeys in a dominance hierarchy, that is a bullying hierarchy. I wish we had comparable measures of bullying, internationally comparable measures of bullying amongst adults, but we don't. You also see, as this paper suggests, that the sort of dominance characteristics, physical dominance characteristics, are preferred by women in more unequal societies. You know, you in computer enhanced masculine faces, emphasizing the jawline and so on. And those more masculinized faces are more strongly preferred by women in more unequal societies. You also see that apparently women present themselves in more sexually specific ways in more unequal societies. And that isn't just a relationship with gender difference in pay, it's actually a relationship with wider inequality of incomes. So I think that these very widespread effects of inequality are rooted in our evolved sensitivity to these issues. And basically, we have to change our view of inequality from being something to do with simply material differences in the standards of living to thinking about it in terms of that it is, inequality is a social relationship, creating issues of superiority and inferiority, putting us in that hierarchy. That's what inequality is about. I'm sure I've overrun my time, I'm sorry. But I do think it's a great book and a great contribution, and I shall enjoy thinking about it for years to come.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. I really, the original idea is that we are working in UCL closely with Osaka. I'd have spent quite a lot of March in Osaka and would be able to think very much more of in terms of experience about this book, as well as in terms of the research that I've done. Unfortunately, like so much else, that hasn't happened this year, but we're still looking towards next year for doing it. And in the meantime, I've had the pleasure of reading this book, and my research is mainly about dementia, which is of course very relevant for Japan, and really thinking about how my worldwide research applies to Japan. So if it's all right with you, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to talk a bit about, just to show you a few graphics about dementia or the cause of dementia in the world, and about possible things that we could change, but then to think about how it applies to Japan, because it's quite puzzling when you think of Japan, and I have some ideas, but I don't know if they're true. So I'm going to start talking about it now, and share my screen. Just give me a second for it to work. So
Jill, do you want to put your presentation? Yeah.
I have, right. Yeah. I don't know, there's something strange happening. So
that's good.
Yeah, good. So I'm going to talk quite a lot of the background work that I'm talking about was published in the Lancet in July this year, and is not just my work, but is the work of a huge group of people who work together. And the paper is Dementia Prevention, Intervention and Care, and you're very welcome, anyone, to look at it. So dementia is one of the things that's very interesting about dementia is there's clearly a global increase in the numbers of people with dementia with the welcome increase in the aging population. So as fewer and fewer people die young, there are more older people. And that's particularly true in Japan, where there isn't a replacement level of fertility within the population. So there's proportionately more older people, as well as more older people in an absolute way. And currently there's thought to be about 50 million people with dementia worldwide, and that's expected to rise to 132 million by 2050. And that's extremely important because individuals don't want to develop dementia, and in many countries there's surveys which ask people aged 50 and over which disease they most fear, and it used to be mainly stroke, but now it's mainly dementia, and it's the most feared disease that people think they may develop, and I can understand it very well, because you lose your independence, you lose your memory and personality and your past life with it. So it's very feared, and also people in your family have to look after you, and it has a massive economic effect, because then you have to be, if people in your family can't look after you, and often they can't, or will particularly be the case in Japan, there won't be that many people with families to look after, then you have to be looked after by the state. Nonetheless, while there are more people with dementia, the incidence in some countries has decreased. So there are fewer people per 100,000 of older people, while there are more overall because there are more older people. And it's about 25% decrease the incidence in the past 20 years in the United States, United Kingdom, France, Holland, and Sweden, suggesting that dementia is at least partially preventable. However, in some countries, there's been a stable and increased prevalence of dementia, and that includes, according to the reports, Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, as well as countries like Brazil and India. And that suggests that while dementia is potentially preventable, it's not inevitably preventable. It's not that we're just leading to a time when fewer and fewer people have, and it suggests that it matters what you do. And this slide is trying to look at what's actually happening in people's brains. And the four top ones are looking at people with different levels of cognitive performance and how much abnormality, neuropathology they have. So if you look at the lowest one on the left-hand corner, you can see that on average, as you might expect, people with late dementia have more neuropathology than people with early dementia, and they have more than people with low performance cognitively, and they have more than people with high performance. But if you look at the graphs above, which look at individuals, you can see that there are some people with high cognitive performance who have more neuropathology, more abnormalities in their brain than quite a lot of people with severe dementia. And equally, there are people in all of these categories who overlap with each other, suggesting it's not just what's going wrong in your brain, it's how resilient your brain is to what is going wrong. And that concept is called cognitive reserve. And we think that cognitive reserve, the ability of the brain to withstand abnormalities without developing dementia, is something that's related to intellect and education, but is also related to what you might do during life. And we think that there's never a time during life when it's too early or too late to make a difference, depending upon changing what you do or changing what society does. So we have, within the Lancet Commission, what we did is we did a life course analysis of different risk factors that might relate to dementia, looking at the worldwide evidence. Worldwide evidence doesn't necessarily apply to every individual country. In fact, probably the other way around, it necessarily doesn't apply to every individual country. And these are the 12 risk factors that we came up with which had the most effect, or the most, not necessarily most effect, but have the most evidence of effect. So in early life, there is less education, and that's a big risk factor. And at midlife, there's high blood pressure, obesity, and you can see from what Eric said in the beginning, there's not a lot of that around in Japan, so you'd expect people to be more protected. Peripheral hearing loss, traumatic brain injury, excessive alcohol, and again, in Japan, there's much less excessive alcohol. Quite a lot of people actually have a gene which prevents them metabolizing alcohol. And in Health in Japan, in the book, which is now my Bible telling me about everything, it says about 50% of people, of adults in Japan, drink, and that's many fewer than people in, for example, the United Kingdom. And in late life, there is smoking, depression, physical inactivity, air pollution, social isolation, and diabetes. So we put this all together in a life course analysis, a diagram of a life course analysis showing, and we did some complex maths like all of us do, so that because people are not like rats, they have several things happening at once, so you have to think about all of these risk factors, that people have a cluster of risk factors. We corrected for that. And this is our life course analysis of early life, midlife and late life, with the different amounts, and looking at the whole population of the world, how much accounts for it. Interestingly, not as I would have predicted before we started all this work, the most important risk factor is hearing loss. And if you look at hearing loss followed by education, followed by smoking, that accounts for 20% of potentially modifiable risk for the whole population. And all of these 12 risk factors account for about 40% of potentially modifiable risk factors. We think that genetics accounts for about 7%, and that means that there's about 50%, that's for the whole world, it's different populations, that we don't really know about. But it's a real change in my lifetime as a doctor and an academic, where we begin to see the potential for preventing dementia or pushing it back, which starts in childhood and moves on throughout life. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now to talk a little bit more about some of these individual risk factors and how these apply throughout life. And I'm going to plug in my second screen so I can see both my notes and Eric. So if I talk too long, it will be obvious. So let me start off with education. It's the earliest. Education is very important for cognitive reserve, and we think that education in these calculations up to about the age of 14, which is where it's compulsory in Japan up to, for people who don't have it, and that's 40% of the world, that accounts for around about 7% of the whole world's dementia, people just not having that education. We think that continuing education till age 20 is additionally protective, and you continue to have this brain which can change quite dramatically up until about the age of 20. And after the age of 20, we think it still makes a difference, but it's much less. Your brain changes much less. And we know that people in cognitively demanding jobs, so hopefully that's many of us, show less cognitive deterioration. And there's also evidence that retiring may increase deterioration. So if you look at countries with earlier retirement age, then they tend to have more deterioration rather than just looking at individuals, because obviously individuals who retire early may be retiring early because they actually have problems in they have health problems. So then the hearing is the highest population risk. And we first published this in 2017, and that led to a flurry of research, people looking at their populations. And very, very interestingly, they found looking at cohorts which they'd already gathered, that hearing, and we were talking about hearing, we calculated this in hearing that was measured about 15 years before the cognitive deterioration. So it wasn't that people, it was the hearing precedes the cognitive deterioration, but looking at that, the people who use hearing aids were protected and they have no higher risk than the rest of the population. And I think that's extremely interesting and hopeful, though of course it may just be a marker of people who look after themselves, but I think it probably isn't. Alcohol, heavy drinking affects the brain. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, but what we found in a new systematic review and meta-analysis is that drinking more than 21 units a week of alcohol, that's in America it's 14 drinks, and it's what people who may not drink heavily may drink, makes you more likely to develop dementia. So even what looks like social drinking, having three drinks with your 2 or 3 glasses of wine with your dinner every night, and they're probably not, given that people tend to drink larger glasses of wine, probably less than that, can really affect your risk of dementia. Equally, traumatic brain injury. It's not surprising that traumatic brain injury can cause brain damage. But when I was at medical school a long time ago, we thought that it caused damage at the time, but if it didn't, you were all right. However, now we know that up to 30 years later, you're at higher risk of developing dementia. And that's from a variety of different reasons where you might be. So anything from sport to road traffic accidents to military incidents. So for example, in the States, traumatic brain injury in people who've been in the military means that as a proportion of people who are developing dementia in their late 30s and 40s, who clearly would not have been. Air pollution is also very important, and that's something which individuals can't control and which is related to policy. High blood pressure increases the risk of late life dementia, and that's all sorts of dementia, Alzheimer's dementia, as well as vascular dementia. Although, the reason why we put it in midlife is that people whose blood pressure falls in late life without anyone doing anything to make it fall are probably developing dementia. So if you just look at it at late life, you get strange results. But we now know that decreasing people's blood pressure makes them less likely to develop dementia. So there's been interventions, randomized controlled trials. And every time somebody tries to do a randomized controlled trial, they have to stop because the non-intervention group does so badly in comparison to the intervention group. I don't think there's going to be many more of them. Social contact has about as much effect as high blood pressure, and I think that's interesting and surprising, and suggests that, because I think that hearing and social blood pressure are partly related to having a cognitively stimulating environment. You have people there. And since we first started to talk about that, we've done a systematic review that shows that lifelong single people have more likely to develop dementia than married people, and widowed people are somewhere in the middle. And probably the easiest way to have social contact, particularly in the pandemic, but even before that, is to live with somebody and to talk to them. Other studies have shown that people who have less social contact, using the Whitehall study, which Eric is very involved in, age 40, 50 and 60, are associated with dementia risk 20, 30, 40 years later, 20 or 30 years later. And a Japanese study of 14,000 people found that the amount of social contact was in a direct line associated over 10 years later with reduced dementia risk. So how does this all fit in with Japan? I mean, as we know, and people keep saying, Japan is a super aging society. People aged more than 65, or in 2020, are 28% of the population. And there's lots of questions which Richard and Eric have stopped in. Improvements in longevity did not stop when reductions in inequality slowed down, suggesting it's not just in inequality, it's not as simple as that. people talk a lot about the fact that Japan is a much less unequal society, and that may be so in some ways, but I think in other ways Japanese women are not really considered, and that the equity of Japanese women is probably much behind the equity of, say, UK women. It's, you know, and I find it interesting that the men writing about it don't really think about women at all. But if you think about the Japanese society, if we think about the socially cohesive society where people seem to talk to each other, we think, where people exercise, and there's exercise in parks, where people are thinner, why do they not have a lower level of dementia rather than, and the study, I think there's some problems with the studies showing that dementia levels are going up, but there's really no studies suggesting they're going down, like as in Western Europe and the US. There's also a very important question in Japan is who's going to care for these people? There's Japanese, I only know this because all these details of reading Health in Japan, but the Japanese population don't even take up all the training places to become carers. There are many fewer younger people. There's very few immigrants within Japan, and that's how in Britain we tend to have been solving, at least up till now, the problem by allowing people in to look after. And the evidence about robots is really not very good, and the idea that robots will help. I wondered whether hearing loss might be part of the reason. It's reported that only 1 in 8 people in Japan who say they have hearing loss use hearing aids. And we know that people vastly underreport their level of hearing loss. So it's probably many more people than the people who say they have hearing loss who have hearing loss, and therefore probably a very low level of hearing. I don't think it's about education, because although education is only compulsory for 9 years, Japan is one of the most highly educated societies, and most people remain in education. Smoking has massively reduced, but it's still high, and smoking is the third most important factor. So hearing loss it's hearing, education, and smoking, and I think hearing and smoking may be important. So in men, it's massively reduced from 82% to 29%, but that's compared to 17% in the USA. So that is still a hugely important factor. And we know that smoking makes a big difference, not only cardiovascular-wise, that it makes a difference to the blood flow, but it's also a direct neurotoxin. And we know that stopping actually makes a difference. It's not obesity, it's not alcohol intolerance. Depression might be related, sorry, it's not alcohol, partly because of the intolerance. Depression may be related to very high suicide rates in Japan. And I think that's something that we should think about. And the other, and when I think about hypertension, one of the things that Japan is really famous for is the reduction in strokes, which used to be very high and which are one of the reasons. Nonetheless, my new Bible, Health in Japan, tells me that the clinics in the community are not as good as they are in hospitals, and hypertension is not always treated very well, and that the older population are still eating very high salt diets, although the younger generation is not. And I wonder if that might be related. And finally, socially cohesive in Japan, but people work amazingly hard and probably have less time to socialize in a relaxed way while they are working. We think we work hard. I think we work hard, but I don't really think we've got anything on the way that people in Japan work. So I think that these speculations and concern, because it's a huge problem, dementia around the world, but dementia in Japan is a bigger problem than when I last went to Japan, and as I walked around, I saw all these fit, slim, older people, and I thought, why do they have a high rate of dementia? Well, they do, and it's a bigger problem instinctively. So I've been thinking about it, and these are my thoughts which I'll share with you, and I recommend you read the book and keep thinking about this remarkable society. So thank you for your attention. I hope I'm not over my 20 minutes.
Thank you, Gill. Thank you so much. You didn't go over time, but what you did do was, in your time, you packed in, first of all, a sort of top-level seminar on the causes of dementia, which I think a lot of people would have found very interesting. And you've also raised lots of interesting points. And I think the issue about gender and health is a very important issue. And what I wrote in my chapter about that, the introductory chapter of the book, was that indeed that Japanese women are right at the bottom of the international league tables as far as political and business participation is concerned. And yet they have this world-beating life expectancy. And my rather pitiful response to that was to say that perhaps we do not understand the culture of Japan as much as we could do in the West, because perhaps it is that women's status should not be seen in relation to the whole of society. Perhaps it is that men and women live in somewhat different worlds where women support each other and provide the stimulation and social support which they need to remain healthy. And of course that then can break down in late life. Lots and lots of very interesting points. Where it's now 5-1, and I hope that well, we can discuss these points later. I'd now like to invite Professor Iso, who is currently in Tokyo, to say a few words about the book, and indeed, hopefully, to introduce himself.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, I appreciate for Daiwa Foundation to provide us such a wonderful book launching workshop. And also I thank Oxford University Press for publishing our book. And Eric, Richard, Gill, and thank you very much for your wonderful talk about our book and comment, many intriguing comment, and makes stimulating our future research. By the way, it's first of all is I'm a little bit thrilling. Gill present us a thrilling figure for projection of dementia number in by 2050 is 132 million people become dementia. It's exactly the same number of census population in Japan. So yeah, but I'm very interested in your comment on dementia epidemiology, and also what's your comment on the why Japanese people is maybe some increase in dementia compared to decline in the UK and the US. So one of the factors is, as we address in the book, is in 1960s, 1970s, 1980, it's midlife hypertension was a strong, very strong factor for high mortality of stroke in 1960s, which is the highest mortality rate in the world of stroke. But in the later years, and more recently, that midlife hypertension may have effect increasing incidence of dementia. It's my guess, but we need to discuss and do more research about why Japanese people has a high prevalence of dementia right now. And also we need to have many implications of social and also social factors, psychosocial factors on the dementia epidemic. And let me see, I just want to talk about the history of this book. It's 2008, as Roman Lehman shock, economic shock is occurred. Just after Lehman shock, Eric Brunner, Professor Eric, came to Japan to visit our laboratory as a sabbatical for 3 months. And we talked to each other about, because at that time in Japan, there was no few recognition of social epidemiology. So we discussed and we may start a summer seminar for social epidemiology. And next year, I visit UCL summer session for social epidemiology, social determined health. And 2010, Michael Marmot come to, and also Eric come to visit Osaka University to open our Osaka University summer seminar. That's a 3-day summer session for social epidemiologists. We have over 20 faculties from USCL and also is Japan. And we attracted over 100 students and participants, more than 100. So it's now today, this year is the 11th anniversary of this seminar. And that's during that, we number of social epidemiologists increased up and up. And when I was in the president of Japan Epidemiological Association in 2013. It's a number of members of this association is 1,500. Now is at 2,500, increasing up 1,000 membership. So almost half of them is related with social epidemiology. So it's now is a number of scientists in the social epidemiology who are interested in social determinant health in Japan is now increasing. So such a during this situation, such this book is give a birth. So I'm very happy and also as that book is wonderful stimulation for UCL and other scientists abroad to think about Japanese epidemiology, Japanese uniqueness, and to discuss more and develop research for social determinant health and other epidemiological study. Because Osaka University UCL now has been done as a Osaka UCL collaborative work for dementia science. So Gill as other, as Eric is other faculties, professors, associate professor come to Osaka University, expect to come to Osaka University for stay at least 1 month and discuss grant application, future research, seminars, such a thing. It's a unique collaborative collaboration. But last year we did successful to launch this project, but this year is COVID-19. We cannot exchange faculties, but I hope in the next year, because it's a vaccine development is some bright news is not only from United States but also England. So as today I heard news from AstraZeneca company in England is developing some good news in the interim result of vaccine development. So I hope next year is we can exchange our faculties, and I hope Eric and Gill come to Japan and discuss more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Iso. It has been a great journey, and I think that I hope that the book will go on to stimulate new, younger researchers to add to the activities. I'd now like to welcome the third editor of the book, Dr. Noriko Cable.
Yes.
I don't know where.
I am
yeah,
here.
she is good. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. I'm the Dr. Noriko Cable, Senior Research Fellow at the Epidemiology and Public Health Department at University College London. I'm really fortunate to be this wonderful time to co-editing this book. And this is from my point of view, I want to say this book, about this book. I'm pretty sure many of you heard of the social determinants of health, the backbone of this book, Health in Japan, from Professor Brunner, and also on today's presenters. But some of you are still thinking, why Japan? And what are relevant to other countries, especially to us and UK people? Well, I could say, buy this book and read yourself, couldn't I? But I would like to give you a few pointers why this book is relevant to us. Firstly, Japan may be an island of far east to the most of the Britons. Not only both countries are developed countries and have universal health care, but also UK and Japan share many things through our history. Even before Choshu 5, typically stoic, stiff upper lips, subtlety, and bonding over solidarity in our culture. That's my observation being the UK residents for the past 20 years. We are living in a time of the COVID pandemic. Many older and ill people lost their lives across the countries. Even able people are facing huge problems like employment and mental health. That is today's problem. And vaccination certainly can help us, but we need to look at the bottom line problems for us to move forward. Is it socioeconomic differences in access to the resources, individual behaviors, or stress response, or even higher up in the system? So this Health in Japan book will give you the answers to such questions. So please buy this book and let us share your thoughts about this book. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Cable. I really liked the point, which has not been made today, that there are similarities between Japan and the UK. And I think that's very, very true. You know, you mentioned the stiff upper lip, but there are many similarities. And yet the differences in health of the populations of Japan and the UK are really quite dramatic. And I think this is where the learning for public health comes into the frame.
So there's obviously a huge amount of useful stuff in the book, which I haven't managed to get my hands on so far. But for anybody who's after all these statistics about Japanese healthcare, it sounds as though it's the place to go. But for today, it just remains to say thank you so much for all of the, well, indeed, all of the 32 authors for the book, but certainly all of the contributors to today's discussion about it. So that's it for today. Goodbye.